In 1945, the world held its breath. For 6 long years, the planet had been consumed by the deafening roar of a global war machine, a sound that had become the very rhythm of life itself. It was the percussive thunder of 1,000,000 rivets being driven home every hour in the sprawling factories of Detroit, Long Beach, and Wichita. It was the high-pitched scream of industrial lathes turning out artillery shells in the mills of Ohio and Pennsylvania. It was the cacophonous thunder of thousands upon thousands of engines coughing to life on airfields from the plains of Kansas to the green fields of England. At its zenith, the American industrial machine, the great arsenal of democracy, was a single, breathing entity, a metallic leviathan that produced an aircraft every few minutes, a ship every single day, a tank every hour. It was the single greatest manufacturing effort in the history of humankind, a tidal wave of steel, aluminum, and raw power, forged for one purpose and one purpose only: total, unconditional victory. And then, in the golden autumn of 1945, victory was achieved. The surrender papers were signed aboard a battleship in Tokyo Bay. The world erupted in a cathartic wave of celebration, and across the globe a switch was flipped. The great roar began to fade. The thunder of the factories subsided into a hum, and then into a whisper. In its place came a silence, a deep, profound, and deeply problematic silence that echoed from the silent assembly lines to the now quiet airfields. This sudden quiet posed a question that no one, in the desperate rush to win, had truly prepared to answer. What do you do with the largest, most powerful, and most hideously expensive military arsenal ever assembled, the day after the war is won? What becomes of hundreds of thousands of aircraft that will never again fly a combat mission? What is the fate of tens of thousands of tanks that will never see another battle? And what is to be done with an ocean of surplus, from boots to bullets to battleships, an inventory so vast, so all-encompassing, that it defied comprehension? The answer is one of the most staggering, visually surreal, and largely forgotten stories of the 20th century. It is the story of how, almost overnight, America transitioned from being the world's greatest builder to becoming the world's greatest, most efficient scrapper. This is the story of the Boneyards, the great graveyards of victory. The sheer scale of the problem was a new form of mathematics, an accounting of the apocalypse that never happened. Government estimates of the value of this leftover arsenal swung wildly, from a low of $25 billion to a high of $150 billion. These were $1,945, a sum that today would represent trillions. This wasn't just a few extra guns and planes. It was everything imaginable. It was mountains of boots that would never be filled by marching feet. It was oceans of sea rations that would never be eaten in a muddy foxhole. It was enough uniforms, helmets, tents, and field gear to outfit the armies of entire continents. But the most visible, the most breathtaking symbol of this glut of victory was in the sky. Or rather, what was no longer needed in the sky. During the war, the United States alone had manufactured a staggering 294,000 aircraft. Let that number sink in for a moment. It is more military aircraft than have likely been built by all the nations of the world combined since the year 2000. Of course, the war had taken its toll. Over 43,000 aircraft were lost in overseas operations, shot down, crashed in bad weather, or vanished over vast oceans. Another 21,000 were lost back home in the United States, consumed by fiery training accidents, ferry flight mishaps, and catastrophic test failures. But even after these staggering losses, America was left with an estimated surplus of 150,000 perfectly good, combat-ready airplanes. A city of parked thunder with no war to win. What do you do with them all? The first, most logical idea was to store them, to create a massive strategic reserve, a fleet of mothballed planes ready to be awakened for a future conflict. But the cold, hard math of peace proved to be even more brutal than the math of war. The cost of storing, preserving, and guarding these aircraft, protecting them from the sun, the rain, the nesting birds, and the slow, insidious creep of rust was astronomical. They were depreciating assets in an age of rapid technological advancement. The dawn of the jet age was already on the horizon, its high-pitched scream rendering the roar of piston engines obsolete almost overnight. The decision, though painful, was unavoidable. The vast majority of them had to go. But before America could deal with the mountain of steel parked on its own soil, it first had to clean up its global backyard, a backyard which now spanned the entire planet. Thousands of US military aircraft sat on hastily built airstrips, from the humid, vine-choked jungles of the Philippines to the scorching deserts of North Africa and the rain-soaked fields of England. Flying them all home was a logistical nightmare, a monumental expenditure of fuel, manpower, and time that the war-weary nation could no longer afford. So, in some of the most surreal and heart-wrenching acts of the post-war era, many of these beautiful, powerful machines were simply disposed of. Imagine the scene on a remote Pacific atoll in 1946. A young naval officer, barely out of his teens, stands with a clipboard under a palm tree, watching as a line of brand-new, gleaming F-4U Corsair fighters, some with only a handful of hours on their engines, are started up one last time. They taxi not to a runway for takeoff, but to the edge of a massive, freshly dug pit. A heavy-set Seabee on a Caterpillar D8 bulldozer then unceremoniously pushes them over the edge, one after another. The crunch of metal, the crack of plexiglass canopies, the sound of wings, designed to soar at 400 miles per hour, being twisted and broken. They are then buried, entombed in the very tropical paradise they were sent to liberate. In other locations, B-25 Mitchell bombers and P-38 Lightning fighters were simply pushed off the ends of piers or the flight decks of transport ships, sinking silently into the deep blue water, becoming instant, ghostly artificial reefs. To the pilots and ground crews who had meticulously cared for these planes, who had trusted their very lives to them, it was a sacrilege, a deeply personal and wasteful tragedy. But to the accountants and logicians in Washington, D.C., it was just cold, hard, economic sense. The war was over. These were just numbers on a ledger, assets to be liquidated. Most of the aircraft, however, did make one final flight, not to a target in Germany or Japan, but to a final, dusty resting place in the vast, dry deserts of the American Southwest. Airfields with names that would become legendary among pilots and scrappers: Kingman in Arizona, Walnut Ridge in Arkansas, Altus in Oklahoma. Kingman, a sleepy desert town, became the most famous boneyard of them all. Imagine the sight in late 1945. What was once a quiet training base suddenly becomes the busiest airport in the world. A young pilot, perhaps on his last flight for the Army Air Forces, would see it first from 10,000 feet. A shimmering metallic sea stretching to the horizon. As he descended, the sea would resolve into individual shapes, the iconic hump of a B-17 Flying Fortress, the twin tails of a B-24 Liberator, the sleek lines of a P-51 Mustang. Every few minutes, another warbird would appear on the horizon, its engines sputtering on the last of its fuel, and land on the long runway, taxiing to the end of a line that seemed to have no end. Within a year, an estimated 5,500 aircraft were flown to Kingman alone, parked wingtip to wingtip under the unforgiving Arizona sun, a silent, metallic forest of propellers and wings. What followed was a process of systematic, efficient, and brutal deconstruction. A private company, the Wunderlich Contracting Company, bought the entire fleet of 5,500 planes for the paltry sum of $2.7 million. Their job was to turn these magnificent symbols of air power back into their base elements. The workforce was a curious mix of local ranchers and young veterans, men who had perhaps flown these very planes in combat over Europe, now moving down the lines with acetylene torches and heavy wrenches. The process was a somber, industrial ballet. First, the planes were demilitarized. All guns, radios, and classified equipment like the Norden bomb site were removed under armed guard. Then came the scavengers. The powerful engines, the propellers, the instruments, the tires, anything of value was stripped out and carefully catalogued to be sold as surplus or spare parts. Then came the executioners. A massive, 30-ton guillotine, essentially a repurposed well-drilling rig, was hoisted high into the desert air and then dropped, slicing through the aluminum fuselage of a B-17 with a sickening crunch, cutting the iconic bomber in half as if it were a loaf of bread. Other machines, nicknamed pickle forks for their shape, massive forklifts with extended tines, would drive up to a plane, jam their forks under the wings, and simply drive backwards, ripping the wings from the body with a terrible tearing sound. The dismembered pieces were then fed into massive mobile smelters, set up right there on the airfield. The complex machines that had been built by the hands of thousands of Rosie the Riveters, machines that had weathered flak over Berlin and fighters over the Pacific, were melted down into anonymous, glowing ingots of aluminum. That very aluminum, which once formed the wing of a hero, would soon find its way into the kitchens, cars, and new suburban homes of a booming post-war America. The sword was literally being beaten into a saucepan. The story was the same on the ground, just with thicker steel. Tens of thousands of tanks, half-tracks, and armoured cars sat in silent, rusting ranks in depots across the country. Many were simply cut up by torches, their armour plate sent to the same foundries that had created them. But some found a second life in an incredible display of post-war ingenuity. M4 Sherman tanks, their turrets removed, became powerful tractors for logging operations in the Pacific Northwest and for ploughing vast fields in the Midwest. M3 half-tracks were converted into construction vehicles, dump trucks, and bulldozers. The tools of war were being physically transformed into the tools of rebuilding, their swords beaten into literal plowshares. The iconic Willys Overland Jeep, perhaps the most beloved and versatile vehicle of the war, had its own unique global fate. Nearly 650,000 had been produced. They were tough, reliable, and had become ubiquitous across the globe. Rather than undertake the massive expense of transporting the thousands of Jeeps left in Europe and Asia back to the States, many were sold for pennies on the dollar or simply given to local farmers, aid organizations, and fledgling governments. The American Jeep became a global symbol of post-war recovery, ploughing fields in France, hauling goods in the Philippines, and becoming the ancestor of civilian utility vehicles from the Land Rover to the Toyota Land Cruiser. And what of the mighty Navy? The fleet that had won the Pacific, hundreds of warships, from nimble destroyers to colossal aircraft carriers, now sat idle in harbors from San Diego to Philadelphia. These became the mothball fleets or ghost fleets. In a meticulous process, they were prepared for a long slumber. Held in reserve, they were anchored in quiet bays, their guns sealed in metal cocoons, their vital equipment and engine rooms dehumidified and sealed airtight, waiting for a war that, for most, would never come. Over the decades, they would be slowly picked apart for spare parts to maintain. The active fleet, sold for scrap to foreign nations, or towed out to sea and scuttled to form artificial reefs for marine life. But a few of these proud ships, veterans of Pearl Harbor, Midway, and Okinawa, were chosen for a far more violent and symbolic end. In the summer of 1946, at a remote Pacific atoll called Bikini, some of the most famous warships of the war, including the legendary aircraft carrier USS Saratoga and the battleship USS Arkansas, were assembled as targets. They were not targeted by enemy planes, but by something new, something that rendered their armor and guns instantly obsolete. They were used as floating guinea pigs for America's new atomic bombs in Operation Crossroads. They survived the first airburst test, but the second, an underwater detonation, was fatal. These heroes of the old war were lifted from the sea by a column of radioactive water and sent to the bottom, sacrificed to test the power of the weapon that had ended one war and defined the terrifying new reality of the Cold War. The scale of the surplus was not just in vehicles. At one army depot, a single pile of scrap brass, mostly unused artillery shell casings, weighed 18 million pounds. The war effort had been so overwhelming, so all-consuming in its single-minded focus, that it had overshot its target by an unimaginable margin. This wasn't a failure. It was the inevitable, surreal consequence of a nation that had committed its entire soul to achieving unconditional victory at any cost. The price of winning was creating a surplus so vast it had to be destroyed. And so, the great Boneyards of 1945 to 1948 represent a unique, melancholy, and profoundly beautiful chapter in American history. They are a monument to an unmatched industrial might. They are a somber graveyard of legendary machines, each with its own ghost stories of courage and sacrifice. And they are a testament to a fleeting time when an entire nation dedicated itself to a single, unified purpose. The men and women who built these machines had won the war. The men who then took them apart were, in their own way, building the peace. The next time you see a vintage, polished aluminum Airstream trailer from the 1952, or cook with an old cast-iron skillet, or see an old, rusting farm jeep sitting forgotten in a field, take a moment. You might just be looking at the ghost of a B-24 Liberator that flew over the oil fields of Ploesti. You might be touching the reincarnated steel of a Sherman tank that rumbled through the streets of a liberated French town. The great war machine was silenced, its roar replaced by the whisper of the desert wind through empty fuselages. But its echo, melted down, reformed, and repurposed, is still with us today, a quiet, tangible reminder of the day the war was won, and the monumental, bittersweet task of scrapping the victory began.